The gravel crunched under the tires of my old sedan as I pulled up to the house that would be my home for the foreseeable future. I, Sarah Mitchell, 32-year-old writer and seeker of solitude, had finally found my perfect retreat. At least, that's what I thought as I stepped out of the car and gazed up at the looming Victorian structure before me. The house stood 3 stories tall, its weathered clapboard siding a faded gray that seemed to blend with the overcast sky. Gabled windows stared down at me like lidless eyes, their glass clouded with age and neglect. The porch creaked ominously as I climbed the steps, my suitcase bumping against each riser. I fumbled with the ancient key the realtor had given me, feeling a strange reluctance as I slid it into the lock. With a groan that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the house, the door swung open. The musty scent of disuse assaulted my nostrils as I stepped inside. "Home, sweet home," I muttered to myself, my voice sounding small in the cavernous entryway. The foyer was dim, dust motes dancing in the weak light, filtering through grimy windows. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister worn smooth by countless hands long gone. To my right, an arched doorway led to what I assumed was the parlor. To my left, a long, dark hallway stretched into the depths of the house. I decided to start my exploration with the parlor. As I stepped inside, I felt as if I'd traveled back in time. Heavy velvet curtains, faded and moth-eaten, framed tall windows that looked out onto overgrown gardens. Furniture draped in yellowed sheets stood like silent sentinels. I moved deeper into the room, my footsteps muffled by a threadbare Persian rug. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with tarnished candlesticks and a gilded mirror. So spotted with age, I could barely make out my reflection. As I peered into its cloudy surface, a movement caught my eye. I whirled around, heart pounding, but the room was empty save for the shrouded furniture. And me. "Get a grip, Sarah," I chided myself. "It's just an old house." I spent the next few hours methodically exploring each room on the ground floor. The dining room boasted a table long enough to seat 20, its surface dulled by years of neglect. The kitchen was a time capsule of early 20th century life, complete with a cast iron stove and a dry sink. An old icebox stood in one corner, and I made a mental note to check if it was still functional. As I moved from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. More than once, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was never anything there. Just shadows and dust. By late afternoon, I had finished my tour of the ground floor and decided it was time to bring in my belongings. As I stepped outside, the contrast between the gloomy interior and the fading daylight was stark. I took a deep breath, savoring the crisp autumn air. It took several trips to bring in all my boxes and suitcases. With each journey into the house, I felt a growing sense of unease, as if the very walls were closing in around me. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to fatigue and an overactive imagination. As twilight approached, I decided to venture into the woods surrounding the property. The trees loomed, tall and ancient, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The underbrush was thick, and more than once I thought I heard something scurrying just out of sight. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves, their rustle underfoot the only sound in the eerily quiet woods. As I ventured deeper, the trees seemed to press closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the fading light. I stumbled over a root and caught myself against a tree trunk, its bark rough. Under my palm, that's when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I almost missed it. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, a sibilant sound just on the edge of hearing. Words I couldn't quite make out, spoken in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Heart pounding, I turned and ran back towards the house, branches whipping at my face and arms as I fled. I burst out of the tree line, gasping for breath, and didn't stop until I was back on the porch. As I looked back at the woods, they seemed peaceful once more, betraying no hint of the terror I just experienced. Returning to the house, I tried to shake off my unease. It's just your imagination running wild, I told myself. This is exactly what you wanted. Inspiration for your next novel. But as night fell, the house seemed to come alive with sounds. Floorboards creaked in empty rooms. Shadows danced at the corner of my vision. And somewhere, deep in the walls, I could have sworn I heard something scratching. I busied myself with unpacking, hoping the mundane task would calm my nerves. As I arranged my clothes, in the massive wardrobe in the master bedroom, I heard a thump from somewhere above me. I froze, listening intently. Silence stretched for long moments, and I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. When I heard it again, a distinct thud, as if something heavy had fallen. Curiosity warred with fear as I debated investigating the sound. In the end, curiosity won out. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the attic stairs, hidden behind a door at the end of the second-floor hallway. The narrow stairs protested under my weight as I ascended, armed with nothing but my flashlight and my curiosity. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a space cluttered with the detritus of past lives. Dust motes danced in the air, stirred by my passage. The attic was a maze of forgotten treasures and discarded memories. I picked my way through stacks of trunks and piles of yellowed newspapers. Old paintings leaned against the walls, their subjects obscured by layers of grime. A rocking horse stood silent, sentinel in one corner, its painted eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. And then I saw it. A door, small and unremarkable, set into the far wall of the attic. Its presence wouldn't have been odd, except for one detail: a heavy padlock, looking far newer than anything else in the attic, securing it firmly shut. My heart raced as I approached the door. I tugged at the lock, but it held fast. What could be so important or so dangerous that someone had gone to such lengths to keep it hidden away? As I stood there, contemplating the mystery before me, a sound froze the blood in my veins. From behind the locked door came a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was the sound of something breathing. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the attic. In my haste, I knocked over a stack of old magazines. They fell with a crash that seemed deafening in the tense silence. I held my breath, waiting. The breathing behind the door had stopped. For a long moment, I stood there, ears straining in the darkness. Then, from behind the locked door, came a new sound. A scratch, faint but distinct, like nails dragging across wood. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and fled, taking the attic stairs two at a time, not stopping until I was back in the relative safety of the second-floor hallway. I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. As my pulse slowly returned to normal, I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. An animal, perhaps, that had somehow found its way into the walls of the old house. Yes, that had to be it. What else could it be? But deep down, a part of me knew that whatever was behind that locked door was no ordinary animal. And as I made my way back to my bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something that was never meant to be discovered. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind against the windows sent my imagination into overdrive. And always, at the back of my mind, was the memory of that locked door and the unseen presence that lurked behind it. As the first gray light of dawn crept through my window, I knew one thing for certain. My stay in this house was going to be far from the peaceful writing retreat I had envisioned. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of the horrors that awaited me in my new home. Sleep had eluded me all night, my mind racing with the events of the previous day. As the first rays of the sunlight crept through my window, I decided to forego any further attempts at rest. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I made my way downstairs to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my feet as if the house itself was groaning awake. The ancient coffee maker I'd unpacked last night sputtered to life, filling the air with the comforting aroma of brewing coffee. As I waited, I booted up my laptop, determined to uncover the secrets of my new home. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I delved into the history of the house. The local historical society's website proved to be a goldmine of information. The house, I learned, was built in 1887 by a wealthy industrialist named Ezra Blackwood. As I scrolled through the pages, a chill ran down my spine. The Blackwood family's history was marred by tragedy. Ezra's wife, Cordelia, disappeared under mysterious circumstances just 3 years after the house was completed. The official report stated she had run off with a lover, but rumors persisted of foul play. Their only child, a daughter named Abigail, died at the age of 16, officially from tuberculosis, but whispers in the town suggested a darker fate. I dug deeper, uncovering a pattern of unexplained deaths and disappearances linked to the house over the decades. In 1923, a family of 4 vanished without a trace, leaving behind a half-eaten meal on the dining room table. In 1956, a reclusive author who had taken up residence in the house was found dead in the attic, his face frozen in an expression of abject terror. My coffee had long gone cold by the time I looked up from my research, my mind reeling from the dark history I'd uncovered. The house seemed to press in around me, its shadows deeper, its silence more oppressive. A sharp knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. My heart raced as I approached the entrance, images of ghosts and vengeful spirits flashing through my mind. I took a deep breath and opened the door. "Well, good morning, neighbor," a cheerful voice greeted me, belonging to a man in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes crinkled at the corners. "I'm Frank Henderson, live just down the road. Thought I'd come by and welcome you to the neighborhood." Relief washed over me. "Sarah Mitchell," I introduced myself, managing a smile. "It's nice to meet you, Frank. Would you like to come in for some coffee?" Frank's eyes darted past me, scanning the interior of the house. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his expression. Concern? Fear? But it was gone so quickly I convinced myself I'd imagined it. "Coffee sounds great," he said, following me into the kitchen. As I brewed a fresh pot, Frank chatted amiably about the area, pointing out the best places to shop and eat in town. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was avoiding talking about the house itself. "Frank," I said, setting a steaming mug in front of him, "what can you tell me about the history of this place? I've been doing some research, and well, It seems like there's been a lot of tragedy here. Frank's jovial demeanor faltered for a moment. He took a long sip of coffee before responding. Well, Sarah, every old house has its stories. This one, perhaps more than most, but I wouldn't put too much stock in old legends and gossip. But the disappearances, the deaths, surely there must be some truth to it, I pressed. Frank sighed, his eyes taking on a distant look. I've lived here all my life, Sarah. Seen families come and go. From this house. Some stayed longer than others. Some left in a hurry. But that's all in the past. Now, there was something in his tone, a note of finality, that made me hesitate to push further. Instead, I steered the conversation to lighter topics, but my mind was churning. Frank knew more than he was letting on. I was sure of it. As Frank was leaving, he paused at the door. Sarah, he said, his voice low. Be careful in this house. Sometimes it's better not to go looking for answers. With that cryptic warning, he was gone, leaving me with more questions than ever. The rest of the day passed in a blur of further research and unsettling discoveries. I found old newspaper clippings detailing gruesome accidents on the property, accounts of strange lights seen in the windows when the house was supposed to be empty, and whispered tales of unearthly screams echoing through the night. As evening fell, my gaze kept being drawn to the ceiling, towards where I knew the locked attic door waited. The mystery of what lay behind it gnawed at me, Frank's warning warring with my curiosity. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed a toolkit I'd brought for minor repairs and made my way up to the attic. The padlock on the door was old, but sturdy. It took nearly an hour of fumbling with lock, picks, a skill I'd picked up for a previous novel and never thought I'd actually use, before I heard the satisfying click of the lock opening. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. Part of me screamed to turn back, to heed Frank's warning and leave well enough alone. But I had come too far to stop now. The door creaked open, revealing a small room bathed in shadows. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the contents of the hidden chamber. What I saw made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in strange symbols, a mix of what looked like ancient runes and more modern graffiti. Candle stubs littered the floor, surrounding a large pentagram drawn in what I prayed was red paint, but feared was something far more sinister. But it was the center of the room that truly horrified me. A large, ornate mirror stood there, its surface black as night. As I stared into its depths, I could have sworn I saw movement, fleeting shapes just beyond the glass. And then I heard it, the same breathing I'd heard the night before, but louder now, more insistent. It seemed to come from the mirror itself, a rhythmic inhale and exhale that filled the small room. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. In the moments before I slammed the door shut, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. But the face staring back at me wasn't my own. It was older, twisted with malice, its mouth opening in a silent scream. I ran from the attic, not stopping until I was outside the house, gulping in the cool night air. As I stood there, shaking, I realized the true horror of my situation. I had unlocked something that was meant to stay hidden, and I feared the consequences of my curiosity were only beginning to unfold. The house loomed behind me, no longer just an old building, but a malevolent presence. And somewhere, inside, behind a door I had foolishly opened, something waited. Something that I now realized had been waiting for a very long time. Sleep eluded me for days after my terrifying discovery in the attic. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner of my eye sent my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a product of an overactive imagination fueled by lack of sleep and the house's grim history. But deep down, I knew better. It started small at first. A book I could have sworn I left on the coffee table would be back on the shelf. The scent of lavender would waft through a room, only to disappear when I tried to find its source. I'd catch glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces, only to turn and find nothing there. But then, on the fifth night, I saw her. I had finally managed to drift off into a fitful sleep when a chill woke me. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the moonlight streaming through the window. And there, at the foot of my bed, stood a woman. She was translucent, her edges blurred and shifting like smoke. Her dress was old-fashioned, high-necked, and floor-length, but I could see the floorboards through the fabric. Her face was gaunt, eyes sunken, and filled with an unfathomable sadness. As I stared, frozen in terror, she lifted a spectral hand, pointing accusingly at me. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just a dream. When I opened them again, she was gone, but the room remained icy cold. From that night on, the apparitions became more frequent, more tangible. A man in Victorian dress pacing the hallway, vanishing when I blinked. A young girl, no more than 16, standing silently in the corner of the living room, her neck bent at an unnatural angle. Each sighting left me more terrified, more convinced that I was losing my grip on reality. Sleep became my enemy. Each time I closed my eyes, nightmares awaited me. A dream of being trapped. In the attic room, the black mirror growing larger, consuming everything until I was falling into its depths. Other times, I'd be in the basement, the walls closing in as unseen hands clawed at me from the darkness. The worst, though, were the nights of sleep paralysis. I'd wake, unable to move, a crushing weight on my chest. In the shadows of my room, figures would gather, whispering in languages I couldn't understand. They'd draw closer, their features becoming clearer, faces twisted in agony or frozen in screams. I'd try to cry out, to move, but remain helpless until dawn broke and the apparitions faded away. After a particularly harrowing night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I knew just who to ask. I made my way to Frank's house, my neighbor with the kind eyes and cryptic warnings. Frank opened the door before I could knock, as if he'd been expecting me. "It's time we talked, isn't it?" he said, his voice heavy with resignation. I followed him into his living room, cluttered with books and old photographs. As I sank into an overstuffed armchair, Frank poured us both a generous measure of whiskey. "I suppose you've been seeing things," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my hands shaking as I took a sip of the burning liquid. "Frank, what's happening to me? What is that house?" Frank sighed, suddenly looking much older than his years. "That house, Sarah, is a wound in the world. A place where the veil between our reality and something else is thin." He went on to tell me a story that chilled me to my core. The house, it seemed, had always been a place of power. The land it was built on had been sacred to indigenous peoples long before Ezra Blackwood laid the foundation stones. Blackwood, Frank explained, hadn't been just a wealthy industrialist. He'd been an occultist, obsessed with piercing the veil between worlds. The disappearances, the deaths, they weren't accidents, Frank said. his voice barely above a whisper. They were sacrifices. Blackwood believed he could gain immortality by offering souls to whatever waits on the other side of that veil. I felt sick, remembering the symbols I'd seen in the attic room, the black mirror that seemed to breathe. But Blackwood is long dead. Why is all this still happening? Frank's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of pity and fear. Because, Sarah, the thing Blackwood awakened is still there, still hungry, and now it's awake again. As I left Frank's house, my mind reeling from his revelations, I knew I couldn't stay in the house another night. I needed to pack my things and leave immediately. But as I approached my car, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The world tilted, and suddenly I was falling, tumbling into darkness. I came to in the basement of the house, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The single bare bulb flickered weakly, casting shifting shadows on the stone walls. As I struggled to my feet, my hand brushed against a section of wall that felt different. Heart pounding, I ran my fingers along the rough stone, feeling for any irregularity. There, a slight protrusion, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it. I pressed, and with a grinding sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, a section of wall swung inward. A hidden passage gaped before me, a tunnel of absolute darkness stretching into the earth. The air that wafted from its depths was cold and stale, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something alien and indescribable. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this house and never look back. But a deeper part of me, the part that had always pushed me to uncover the truth, no matter the cost, propelled me forward. As I stepped into the passageway, the wall swung shut behind me with a damning finality. I was committed. Now, for better or worse. My flashlight, thankfully still in my pocket, illuminated rough-hewn steps leading down into the earth. With each step I took, the temperature dropped. The walls seemed to press in closer, and I could have sworn I heard whispers echoing from the depths below. But there was no turning back now. Whatever secrets this house held, whatever horrors awaited me, I was determined to uncover them. As I descended deeper into the earth, into the very heart of the house's mysteries, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking willingly into the jaws of something ancient and terribly, terribly hungry. The horrors I had experienced so far, I realized with growing dread, were just the beginning. The true, haunting, the real test of my sanity and survival lay ahead in the suffocating darkness of this hidden passage. And as the last glimmer of light from the basement faded behind me, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The hidden passage seemed endless, winding deeper into the earth with each step I took. The air grew thicker, heavy with the scent of damp soil and something else, something ancient and unnatural. My flashlight beam danced across rough stone walls, revealing strange carvings that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. After what felt like hours, the passage opened into a vast underground chamber my light couldn't reach. The ceiling, lost in the inky blackness above. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with what I feared was centuries-old blood. As I approached the altar, my foot struck something. I looked down and stifled a scream. A human skull grinned up at me, its empty eye sockets seeming to follow my movement. The floor, I realized with growing horror, was littered with bones. That's when I saw it, an ancient tome resting on the altar, its cover made of what looked disturbingly like human skin. With trembling hands, I opened it, coughing as dust billowed up from its pages. The book was written in a language I didn't recognize, but as I flipped through the brittle pages I found diagrams and illustrations that made my blood run cold. They depicted rituals, dark, terrible rituals, involving human sacrifice and communion with otherworldly entities. One illustration in particular caught my eye. It showed the house, recognizable even in this centuries-old drawing. Below it was a diagram of the chamber I stood in, with the altar at its center. The pages that followed described a ritual, a means of cleansing the house of its dark energy and sealing away whatever malevolent force Blackwood had awakened. I knew then what I had to do. This house, this wound in the world, as Frank had called it, needed to be closed, and I was the one who had to do it. Stumbling back up the passageway, my mind raced with preparations. The ritual required specific items: candles made from pure beeswax, salt from the Dead Sea, sage bundles, and, most unsettlingly, a vial of my own blood. The next few hours passed in a blur. I raided New Age shops and specialty stores in town, ignoring the strange looks I received as I frantically gathered the necessary components. By the time I returned to the house, night had fallen, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. As I approached the front door, a movement caught my eye. A car I didn't recognize was parked in the driveway, its engine still ticking as it cooled. My heart raced. Who could be here? I entered cautiously, my arms full of ritual components. Voices drifted from the living room, one I recognized as Frank's, and another, unfamiliar and agitated. "We have to stop her, Frank. You know what will happen if she goes through with this." The unknown voice was saying as I stepped into the room. Frank and a woman I'd never seen before turned to face me. The woman was elderly, her silver hair tied back in a severe bun, her eyes sharp and filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Fear, anger. "Sarah," Frank said, his voice heavy. "This is Margaret Blackwood, Ezra Blackwood's great-granddaughter." Margaret's eyes bored into me. "You foolish girl," she spat. "You have no idea what you're meddling with." Over the next hour, a story unfolded that shook me to my core. The Blackwood family, it seemed, had been the guardians of this house for generations. The rituals, the sacrifices, they weren't meant to gain immortality as Frank had believed. They were containment measures, keeping at bay a cosmic horror that, if unleashed, would consume not just this house, but the entire world. "The barrier is weakening," Margaret explained, her voice trembling. "It must be renewed, or all is lost." "Renewed how?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. Margaret's eyes met mine, filled with a terrible resolve. "With blood, girl. A willing sacrifice." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Frank looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I felt sick, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd learned. But there was no time to process, no time to think of alternatives. As if to emphasize the urgency, the house groaned around us, the walls seeming to flex inward. In the distance, I heard the shattering of glass. "It's starting," Margaret said, her face pale. "We're out of time." What happened next was a whirlwind of frantic activity. We rushed to the underground chamber, our arms laden with the ritual components I'd gathered and additional items Margaret had brought. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy, making my hair stand on end. As Margaret began setting up for the ritual, tracing complex symbols on the floor with salt, Frank pulled me aside. "Sarah," he whispered, his eyes pleading, You don't have to do this. We can find another way." But looking at the fear etched on Margaret's face, feeling the malevolent presence growing stronger by the second, I knew there was no other way. This was my responsibility. I had opened this door, and now I had to close it. "Tell me what to do," I said to Margaret, my voice steadier than I felt. The ritual began as the clock struck midnight. Candles flickered in a wide circle around the altar, their light casting writhing shadows on the chamber walls. Margaret's voice rose and fell in a language that hurt my ears to hear, each syllable seeming to bend reality around us. I stood before the altar, a silver dagger in my hand, its edge gleaming wickedly in the candlelight. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for Margaret's signal. But then, everything went wrong. A howling wind tore through the chamber, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. I heard Frank cry out, followed by a sickening thud. Margaret's chanting became more frantic, more desperate. In the pitch black, I felt something brush against me, something that wasn't human. A whisper filled my mind, promising power, knowledge, immortality if only I would submit. I gripped the dagger tighter, my palms slick with sweat. This was the moment of truth, the fate of. Everything hung in the balance, and it all depended on my choice. As I raised the dagger, ready to complete the ritual, a blinding light filled the chamber. The last thing I heard was Margaret's scream of despair before the world dissolved into chaos around me. In that moment, suspended between heartbeats, I realized that the true horror was only beginning. Whatever came next, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The ritual had begun, but its consequences were yet to unfold in ways none of us could have foreseen. The blinding light faded, leaving me disoriented in the suffocating darkness of the ritual chamber. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with growing horror that I was alone. Frank and Margaret were gone, leaving no trace of their presence. But I wasn't truly alone. A low, rumbling laugh echoed through the chamber, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air grew thick, almost gelatinous, making each breath a struggle. At last, a voice purred, its timbre sending shivers down my spine. "After centuries, I am free." Before my eyes, the darkness coalesced, taking shape. What emerged was beyond description, a writhing mass of shadows and teeth, of eyes that shouldn't exist, and limbs that defied geometry. This, I realized, with a sinking feeling, was the true evil of the house, the cosmic horror that the Blackwoods had sought to contain for generations. What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The thing laughed again, the sound grating against my sanity. "I am the thing that lurks in the spaces between realities. I am the nightmare that gods themselves fear. And now, thanks to you, I am free to consume this world and all others." As it spoke, images flashed through my mind. Visions of cities crumbling, of the sky tearing open to reveal eldritch horrors beyond imagining, of humanity driven to madness and extinction. And, at the center of it, all was me, the foolish writer who had stumbled into forces far beyond her understanding. But as the terror threatened to overwhelm me, something else stirred within, a spark of defiance, of determination. I had started this, yes, but that meant I could end it too. "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I won't let that happen." The entity seemed amused by my defiance. "And how do you propose to stop me, little mortal? Your ritual has failed. Your allies are gone. You stand alone against the inevitable." As it spoke, the chamber around us began to shift and warp. The walls became fluid, revealing glimpses of other places, other times. I saw the house as it had been through the centuries, witnessed the rituals, the sacrifices, the slow corruption of reality itself. But I also saw something else, flashes of my own life, my childhood fears, my adult insecurities, every doubt and regret I'd ever harbored. The entity was rifling through my memories, my very soul, looking for weaknesses to exploit. "Your fear sustains me," it hissed. "Your doubts give me form. Why resist? Give in to the darkness. Embrace the chaos." For a moment I felt myself wavering. The task before me seemed impossible. How could I, one insignificant human, hope to stand against a cosmic force of evil? But then I remembered something, a detail from the ritual book that had seemed insignificant at the time. The power of the house, of the entity itself, was tied to belief, to fear. It fed on the darkness in human hearts, growing stronger with each ounce of terror it inspired. Which meant, "No," I said again, this time with conviction. "I reject your reality. I deny your power." The entity recoiled as if struck. "Foolish girl," it snarled. "You cannot simply wish me away." "Can I?" I countered, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "You exist because we believe in you, because we fear you. But fear is a choice, and I choose not to be afraid." With each word I felt stronger. The oppressive atmosphere in the chamber began to lift, the writhing. Shadows of the entity seemed less substantial, its form less certain. But it wasn't going down without a fight. With a roar that shook the foundations of the house, it lashed out. Tendrils of darkness whipped toward me, promising oblivion. I stood my ground, focusing on every moment of joy, of love, of light in my life. I thought of the books I'd written, the lives I'd touched with my words. I remembered the feeling of sun on my face, of laughter shared with friends, of the simple pleasure of a cup of coffee on a quiet morning. "You have no power here," I declared. "This is my story, and in my story, love triumphs over fear, light banishes darkness, hope overcomes despair." The entity howled, its form unraveling. The chamber filled with a maelstrom of shadow and light, a tempest of colliding realities. I felt myself being torn apart and remade with each passing second. And then, suddenly, it was over. I found myself back in the living room of the house, sunlight streaming through the windows. Everything looked normal. The oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the house was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. For a moment I wondered if it had all been a dream, a nightmare born from an overactive imagination, and too many late nights writing horror stories. But then I saw them, Frank and Margaret, unconscious but breathing, sprawled on the floor. As I moved to check on them, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror above the fireplace. I gasped. My hair had turned stark white, and there was a depth to my eyes that hadn't been there before. A look that spoke of wisdom earned through unimaginable trials. Frank stirred, groaning as he sat up. "Sarah, what happened?" I helped him to his feet, a wry smile tugging at my lips. "It's a long story, Frank. One I'm not entirely sure I understand myself." As Margaret began to wake as well, I felt a subtle shift in the air. The house creaked, but it was the ordinary sound of an old building settling, not the ominous groans I'd become accustomed to. "Is it over?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, feeling the truth of it in my bones. Yes, it's over. The entity is gone. The wound is healed. But even as I spoke the words, I felt a nagging doubt. Had we truly vanquished an eldritch horror with the power of positive thinking? It seemed too easy, too clean. As if in response to my thoughts, I heard a faint whisper, not in the room, but in the back of my mind. A voice that sounded unsettlingly like my own, yet not. This chapter may be over, it said, but the story is far from finished. I shivered, suddenly uncertain. Had we truly won, or had the entity merely changed tactics, found a new way to influence our world? As I looked at Frank and Margaret, seeing the relief on their faces, I decided to keep my doubts to myself, at least for now. Whatever battles lay ahead, whatever consequences my actions had set in motion, I would face them. For now, it was enough that the immediate threat was over. The house was quiet, the sun was shining, and a new day beckoned. As I helped Frank and Margaret out of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end, but merely the beginning of a much larger story. A story that, for better or worse, I was now an integral part of. The wind whispered through the trees as we stepped outside, carrying with it a promise, or perhaps a warning. Only time would tell which it would turn out to be.